January 6th. Today is April 6th. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club. We meet here every other Wednesday in honor of William Mackey Jr., Louis Rivera, Dr. Professor Amos Wilson, Gil Noble, Minister Khalid, Malcolm X, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Ivan Van Sertima, and all the historians that gave up fame and fortune. Sacrifice, because they wanted to tell the truth. Edwin Scobie. So we meet to try to keep these people's name alive. We don't ever want to forget these people in this day of information, because they didn't have to go the route that they did. They really sacrificed, and we always want to keep their name alive. Miss Leola Maddox, who drove an old car all the way from Patterson, New Jersey, to the United African Movement, because she believed in live lectures. She believed in bringing the people and having the people come. Amen. And ate her dinner in the UAN. Amen. So we always want to keep these people alive. Now, Brother Raji, if you could zoom into the books over here, we have the Amos collection. These books is to help Sababu, African World Info Systems, to continue his work. So we sell these books. We have Blueprint for Black Power. The latest, The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat Toward the Reclamation of the African Mind, Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children, Black-on-Black Violence, African-Centered Consciousness versus the New World Order, Falsification of African Consciousness, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, Jazz and Jam, we have Distorted Truth, and we have Confronting the Color Crisis in the African Diaspora. And also, we have these three books which I recommend for everybody. Dr. Scott Whitaker out of Atlanta, Georgia, called Medicine, Medicin. And he's on YouTube. And these two books, please, family. Dr. McCullough and Robert Kennedy, The Real Anthony Fauci, and The Truth About COVID-19. I beg you, once again, as I do every time I come here, please get these books. We have a couple of them here. These books will give you what's going on. And I'm always begging people to get these books and read them, because you're going to need it to see the murderous chicanery that they're doing. So, I'm going to give a few announcements. I have to write them down, I don't want to forget. On Mondays, we have Komanti Live. Io Komanti, the Irritated Genie, has his radio program. Come on at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Sankofa Radio, WSYP 95.1 out of Birmingham, Alabama. Bad show. Brother Graves did and Cynthia McKinney been on there, Mike Graves, and he has a variety of speakers. That's on Monday. Also, one of the hottest shows on the East Coast on Saturday. Blog Talk Radio with our sister Empress Chi, 10:30 at night. And let me tell you, with everything allegedly opening up, Sister Filet goes beyond the call of duty in our family in Philadelphia. Of course, 10:30 at night now, everybody is moving and grooving and shaking and baking and trying to get their goddamn party on now that the masses is off and the scamdemic is supposed to be coming to an end. But Sister Filet is out there, and it's an excellent program, Blog Talk Radio. You type in Empress Chi, and you go down to New Day Resurrection, and they will give you all the information out of the Million Women's March and everything. It's the hottest show on the East Coast. Also, on Saturdays, we got our brother Darren Muhammad, The State of the City, Saturday, on WEBR 1590 AM, Baltimore, Glen Burnie, and that's on TuneIn Radio. Also, On Saturday, Facebook Live and Instagram titled Muhammad the Comic. That's one of the hottest shows out. Tells you everything that's going on. Also on Fridays and Saturdays, our new connection with Brother Trust Graham. African Echoes, if you get in touch with me in the chat and give me your number, I'll send you the email for the Zoom, and then you can give Danny for the Friday meeting. We're doing the psychology of self-hatred Friday at 8 o'clock, and then Saturday with the Asbury Park, Brother True, they're doing the destruction of black civilization with Chancellor Williams. That's Saturday at 1:30. And once you come on that program, you give Brother True your email and he will send you the information every Saturday and you can log on. That's Saturdays at 1:30 and Fridays at 8 o'clock. So Trust and African Echoes go beyond the call of duty. Because 8 o'clock on a Friday, you know what everybody's trying to do. Also, we have a new program that just came out. I was hip to it from one of our members, Sister Aura, Dr. Aline, Your Immunity Project. If you put your email or your number in there, I will send you the link, and then you can get the link every Tuesday. They come on. Excellent program with Dr. Aline. Also, every Tuesday at 5 o'clock on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, we have Brother Mike Graves, the Noel leader, one of the hottest shows on the East Coast. And that's Community Cop, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. That comes on at 5 o'clock. Excellent program. So, these are just some information and programs that come so everybody can get involved and get the information, because in this day and time, information is of the utmost. So for our members at the 103 Mackey's group, give yourself a big hand for coming out and supporting. Also, our members on the Zoom, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming out and supporting Mackey's. If you want to go on the Cash App and help Mackey's help me out with the refreshments, you make a donation. But my Cash App is in there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, if you want to see all the Community Cop programs, you YouTube Community Cop, and Mike Graves and all the Noah Leader, all the programs that come up. Keisha's program, Thorough Black Talk, hottest show. And you can see the program. That comes on tomorrow at 8 o'clock on Facebook Live. Also, if you want to see all the lectures from the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s History Club, you can go on YouTube, BK William Mackey Jr.'s History Club, and all the videos will come up, and you can see those videos. Except for the 2 band videos from Dr. Lewis, I have the hard copies right here. So without further ado, we have our keynote speaker for tonight, and his topic is going to be a history of the Democratic Party, the bad and the ugly. I want, ladies and gentlemen, give Brother Mike Graves a great big hand.
Why you always got to match it, but why you always got to comment on something? But you always comment on something.
That's what I do for
you.
How's everybody?
All right.
Permission to speak?
Wait.
All right. Let's get started. From the outset, it's good to be here again at the William Mackey Jr. History Club. There are a lot of things that we could talk about, and we always need to be in constant communication, because in the blink of an eye, things change. And as they change, we should always be aware of those changes. Now, there are a lot of things that I could say tonight about the Democratic Party. Ray basically gave me my instructions by telling me to break it up into 2 parts, of which I said I'll do. That's not a problem. And so I'm going to do more of a foundation tonight, and after the foundation, the next week I'll just run with it and go through a whole lot of things in our history that we need to look at. Let me just say from the outset that tonight's program is near and dear to my heart, and I want to dedicate it to someone. Someone we all know, most of us know, especially if you were at UAM, you would know the person. Or if you was here at the William Mackey lecture group, you probably remember him because he sat in the back all the time. This is a person that we didn't get to send away the way we would like to, because there were extenuating circumstances beyond our control. So I know that the brother is, he's an ancestor now, aiding us in all that we do and looking at us. So I want to do our brother Harold Wilbert proud. He would always be the one that would call me after every community college lecture. He would be the one that would call me, and like an uncle or a big brother would tell me what I did right and what I possibly missed. And I took it the way you're supposed to take it when an elder speaks to you. He would say, you got this right, Mike, you got that right, but you left out such and such. Or he said, I know you didn't have but so much time, but this is what you left out. And this was fine, because that was a continuation of another person who always would call and tell me whether something was right or wrong. And his name is James Bryson. So I had 2 people who would always tell me what was good, and would tell me when things were not so good, the things that might have been missed in the discussion. So this one tonight is for Harold, and certainly I'll dedicate it another time, maybe on the next half of this lecture, to Brother James Bryson. But this is to Harold, who I love dearly. And if you ever seen us around, you just would recognize there was just such a great mutual respect for each other. He was the preeminent scholar of the United African Movement. I was an understudy or something. I was just a person that could add my 2 cents. But he was the preeminent scholar of the United African Movement. Anything we wanted to know, we would just ask Harold. And he would just verify it, or just tell us, this is what this was about. And he had that kind of experience, and certainly when it came to the military, him and James were invaluable. So tonight I'm thinking of Harold, and I want to get this stuff right. Now, when you think of the Democratic Party, it is a history. It is not the history. I don't know if anyone can actually give you, in less than a day or two, the history. But, you know, we'll go with a history. And as Ray said, what you said, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
I know, I said the bad and the ugly.
The bad and the ugly, so that means it's not too much good.
I didn't put no good in it.
Okay. So there's not too much good, but we will endeavor to pursue, and maybe we'll stumble on some things that were good and maybe not so good. Now, I think that most of the people here tonight, I dare say that when you do vote, irrespective of what you truly consider yourself, I'm pretty sure that you probably consider yourself a Democrat, at least for voting purposes. I don't know, you know, if you walk the streets telling people, hey, I'm a Democrat, you know, I'm not sure if all of you walk the streets saying you black, or saying you're African, or saying, I don't know who I am, I'm confused at this point. You know, get back to me later. But nonetheless, most of us have voted at one time or another Democrat. And they are, you know, you have to ask yourself why. How did this happen? How did we become, for the most part, over 90% to this day, Democrats? How did this happen, and where in our history did we find ourselves in the Democratic Party? There are reasons. There are reasons that are good and some not so good, but nonetheless, this is where most of us find ourselves today. As you know, many of us, some of us in this room today, Sister Keisha's here today, we participated in electoral politics on a personal level when we were members of the Freedom Party. And we were candidates for various positions. We mapped it all out, and so citywide we were looking at several key positions to more or less make an impact on the city. So we were all running in the Freedom Party, not the Democratic Party, knowing full well that most of our people only vote one way, and that's Democratic, nothing else. We either vote Democrat or we don't vote at all. And we had that understanding in the Freedom Party. Now, we have had most of our elected officials are Democrats. As a matter of fact, there are literally almost no elected officials that are black in the Republican, I guess, except Scott. I'd say Scott, Tim Scott, the U.S. Senator from the state of South Carolina. He's a Republican. And there are a lot of black people in the Republican Party, but I'm talking about in elective office. I just know of Scott offhand. I don't know if there's any other ones other than Scott that are in elective office. Now, let's get started. Where did this all begin? Obviously, we came, most of us, in the hulls of ships and were prisoners of war and were brought here to the Caribbean, brought here to South America, brought here to North America, and against our will. So that was at least our beginning in the West. Now, many of us went through, obviously, the hardships of that sojourn. But there did come a time where, after being here for a while, we did fight. And it took up until the Civil War for us to get some semblance of a voice. The Civil War was the war. It was, in my opinion, I'll say the mother of all wars, in the sense that it freed us. Now, we freed ourselves. It was not benevolence on the part of any elected official that freed us. This was over 200,000 black men that fought in a war for the sole purpose of an opportunity to free ourselves. So, but I'm going to go backwards, but I just wanted to say that that time did come where there was a choice on whether to fight or not, and we chose to fight for the Union Army, to keep America one country. Now, in doing that, it gave us a road to freedom. Now, to go backwards from that, because I'm going to come up to that, I might go past the Civil War a little bit, but not too much further. And then we'll really get involved in some things that will be even more relative today. But from the outset, who's the founder of the Democratic Party? Anybody know?
Jefferson, right?
Jefferson is considered the head. At least he spearheaded the oldest party in America, which was the Democratic Republican Party. So it was Jefferson, you're absolutely right. It was Jefferson. However, it can be debated whether the actual principles that he stood on are the principles that were collectively put together in forming the party. But it was Jefferson. It was Thomas Jefferson. A high school in East New York is named after him. Jefferson Street is named after him. There are a lot of things named after Jefferson. In every black community one can imagine, there are things named after Jefferson. Now, he is the co-founder, him and who's the other person? I give you all a hint. He wrote the Constitution. Anybody knows who wrote the Constitution? The person attributed to writing the majority of the Constitution was Madison.
James Madison?
Yes. Would you know that because of Madison Street or something? It was Madison. So those are the co-founders. But the head of the so-called founding fathers, you know, many of them were founding fathers, of course, in the early years, and they were, many of them soldiers, and they are obviously the first few people that were presidents for many years had a military background. So that would start with George Washington. He was the first president. So let's get this out of the way right now to those, it might be somebody in the audience or on Zoom that's still talking about John Hanson.
Right?
There's a person somewhere out there in the ether that's thinking that John Hanson was the first president of America and that he was a black man. It's not true. It's not true. If there was a black president that preceded George Washington, why didn't any of our black intellectuals, why did Martin Delany, Fred Douglass, Harriet Tubman, why didn't they mention him? You know, why didn't Henry Highland Garnett and others mention him if that was the case? That wasn't the case. The John Hanson that many people, those who ascribe to be Moors, this person came along about 90 years later, roughly during the Radical Reconstruction. And he was an elected official. He became a local elected official. He was not a president. He was not even a U.S. senator or even a congressman. He was a local elected official. And he just happened to have that same name. Now, the person, John Hanson, the person that I'm thinking of was the person who, he was over the Articles of Confederation. They had about 7 people who, during the formation of what became America, he was the first one. Everybody served a year. So there were about 7 of them, roughly about 7 that served a year or less until George Washington became president. Now, George Washington was the first president who did not run in a party. As a matter of fact, he didn't run at all. He was voted in. So George Washington became president without ever running. And this was basically his own choice how he would be addressed. They asked him once, what do you want to be addressed as? And he just said, Mr. President. And to this day, most people, when greeting the U.S. president, they say Mr. President to this very day. So we're talking about over 200 years later, that tradition still exists, Mr. President. So he didn't have a party. His vice president had a party. He was a Federalist. So from after George Washington, when Adams came around, and then after that, you know, you had Jefferson, and then after him you had Madison. They were all members of a party. But the first U.S. president was not a member of a party. And he chose to step down after 2 terms. They asked him if he wanted a job for life, and he said no, 2 terms is enough to get this thing started. And he made an interesting comment, and his comment was, and I just put it there as the famous quote. He said, I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent. So he knew that everything that he was doing would set a precedent. And he understood that clearly. He had a great sense of history, George Washington. And don't mistake, because I said he had a great sense of history, that I'm in any way edifying him. He was from the planter class. I'm going to say that again. I want you all to understand. He was from the planter class. So was Adams. So was Jefferson. So was Madison. The most prominent Americans at that time were from the planter class. Now, there were people that were slowly but surely involving themselves in industry. You know, there was an industrial revolution, but by and large, the planter class ruled. They were the aristocracy. And in being that, they achieved great power and influence over everything. Now, Washington, not only, well, I'll just say he married up. You know, he married somebody that was even richer than him, and so on. So, in that sense, this was power consolidated. And he was a general. He led the French-Indian War, and certainly he led the war against England. Consequently, he was great in the sense that he was a part of establishing America. This is why he was president, didn't have to run against anybody, because he was the preeminent general in that war. So now, you also have John Adams, not to be mistaken for his son, who was the sixth president, John Quincy Adams. Now, he made an interesting statement that I think I'm going to read it. His famous quote was, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." Do y'all understand that, or should I repeat it?
Repeat that one.
His quote is, "I must study politics and war." I'm going to study politics and war. And that's based on, he said, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. In other words, it's a luxury. In other words, if I get this right, I don't have to worry about my sons wasting their time. They don't have the luxury to do what they want to do, because we're going to put this in concrete, what we're establishing here. And when we do it, and we get it right, we know we got it right, we don't have to worry about a war that we don't even see coming, because we got this. We're going to put it on lockdown. So, those were the first two presidents. And like I said, he was a Federalist. There was no Democratic Party yet. Now, lo and behold, there did come a time where Jefferson was next in line. All of these were people that involved themselves in fighting for the establishment to make America an independent country. At that time, there were 13 independent states. And these states were independent governments. And you all know, Patrick Henry, and you all know how that war went. And they were all, it was stages and degrees. And so, in that sense, you had states acting independently at one time, and then the prevailing wisdom said they needed to unite because of things like the Stamp Act and other things that went down that literally forced these states to consolidate against England, with the tariffs, with the level of trade, the first bank of the U.S. There were just a whole litany of things that caused concern, where now it was time for action. Jefferson, and it's interesting, Jefferson's take on everything. Now with Jefferson, he was the founder, he's the co-founder, him and Madison, of what is generally called the Democratic Party. Now we know he was a planter. And I know you all know about Sally Hemings, or Hemings, whatever way you're used to pronouncing it. But she was a black woman. His consort, I would imagine, girl, side piece, whatever you want to call her. And he didn't go anywhere without her. She was his constant companion. Not his wife, his constant companion. Now, he had an interesting statement that the Republicans use today. All across the country in the Republican Party, you see it on their flags, you see it with the MAGA hats, Make America Great Again, those hats. What does it say? It says, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. You understand that? He said from time to time, it's going to be some static. And he said, we're going to do it, we're going to nip it in the bud, and we're going to move on. So there's going to be fights. And he was saying that basically that America and its principles are fluid. It's very fluid. And there's going to be these things that people just don't agree with. And understanding the aristocracy, they're going to fight over it. But after the fight, we're going to move ahead. So that was an interesting quote from him because he was a part of that aristocracy. One of the richest men in the country. He was a person who can't take nothing away from it. Absolutely brilliant. Thomas Jefferson was brilliant. He was the one who wrote, what did he write? Anybody know? The something of independence? What was it? What was it?
Declaration of Independence?
The what?
Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence. He basically wrote that. Okay? A couple of corrections by Madison and others, but basically he wrote it. And that was more of his coming out party long before the Constitution. And in that sense, it showed you that in that room of about 40 to 50 people that basically was that Continental Congress and the ones who wrote the Articles of Confederation, they sent their best. They sent some of their best. Now these were all businessmen and they were all a part of the economy, the agrarian class of planters. They were a lot of brilliant men in their own right. I won't take that away from them. Now, at that time, obviously, we were in chains, right? All of us. It was some free people, but by and large, most of us were in chains. Jefferson was one of the biggest. Him and Washington were among the biggest slave owners. Now, obviously, the more slaves you had, the more power you had because you can kick out more product, whether it was tobacco, whether it was rice, whether it was cotton. There was a time that cotton became king, obviously, but there were different crops that needed, that there was a big need out there for, and they were the agrarian class, so they were in a key position. And from John Adams, well, I'll just say that he was a Democrat also, and that those two were able to form certain things that was key. Now Madison, let me just read a quote by Madison to show you just the dexterity of his thinking. James Madison, who was the 4th president, he said that every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty. Every word in the Constitution, he said, it decides a question between power and liberty. So these guys were on it with respect to what liberty constituted, what freedom constituted. But obviously, they were all sick, right? In another sense. Because they're writing all these illustrious words of freedom, and it didn't include us. Nothing about us. And believe me, they were clear on that. Jefferson knew that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was in the room and saying, well, you know, we're saying that we're going to be free from England, but this don't include no black people. He was clear on that. And obviously in writing the Constitution, they wrote the Constitution and they were comfortable with it only because their thinking was black people are not, they're not people. They're subhuman. Consequently, they don't have the rights and the privileges of white people. And anyway, to vote anyway, you needed to have land at that time. So even white men that didn't own any land or property, they could not vote. Depending on where you was at, for the most part, you couldn't vote. The voting was involving people with land and means. So now we're talking about a situation where the Democrats develop. The Democratic Party isn't developing. You've already had 2 Democratic presidents back to back, and they each did 8 years apiece. And now you're coming up on a situation where the party lines were defined. Now, does anybody know what is a political party? What's a political party first? Let's get some clarity on what it is. What's a political party? Anybody want to take a shot at that? What is a political party? You don't have to get too ingenious, just, Mike, what's a political party?
I'm thinking, ask somebody else. I'm thinking, ask somebody else.
Keisha, what is it?
A political party.
It's an organization that
I'm going to try to put this in a short. It's an organization that determines who governs the country.
That's good. Anybody else?
I like that definition.
A group of people that get together and lobby to get things done for them to stay in power and control.
That's correct. Anybody else?
Yes, a group of people come together to seek power.
Absolutely.
Power.
Absolutely.
That's it. That's my.
Oh, there's no doubt. You're absolutely correct. Anybody else? Okay, just to add to what's already been said, because everybody was right. But they in that process, they would have similar not exact, but similar goals and aspirations. That's part of being in that party. Because if that party's goals and the way it's going to approach those goals are totally different from your outlook, you're probably going to change the party. You're going to change your affiliation at some point. So what everybody said was right. That's basically what it is. Now, if you say, if that's a political party, then what would a political club be?
Same thing.
It's the same thing, but is there anything different about it?
Subset.
It's a subset. It's basically a subset of that, let's say a national group. The political club is a neighborhood group. Somebody said hangout. Who said hangout? You said, you said?
I
No,
did.
somebody said hangout.
I said
It's basically the people, they do hang out. But they hang out with the understanding that there comes a time where they're going to organize for elections. And that developed a little bit in the 17th and more in the 18th and 19th century. The whole concept of political clubs, where people now are getting together and organizing on a grassroots local level. So that's what the political clubs. So we now have political clubs all over, but they are in conjunction with the national to some degree. There might be some variations depending on where you at, but for the most part, they are a subset of the national. So now, you have an aristocratic class that's basically running the country. And while they're running the country, you have a class of people that look like you and I that are in slavery at that time. Now, that party was the Democratic Party, which is the oldest. Now, at that time, there was those that came up in the 1830s, the Whig Party. Now, the Whigs eventually morphed into, for the most part, and became the Republican Party, the present-day Republican Party. But at that time, you had Federalists, and then those who opposed that were anti-Federalists. You had the Democrats, and then you had later the Whigs. Now, who's the most prominent known name who came out of the Whig Party?
Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. He was a Whig. And then later they became Republicans. But at that time, they were the Whig Party. Now, the Whigs had an evangelical side to it, many of them. And that evangelical side was the side of people who became abolitionists. What's an abolitionist?
Someone that opposed slavery?
Someone that opposed the institution of slavery. And so there were those among them that opposed it. Now, Lincoln was not pro-slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. So you ask yourself, well, where you standing at, brother? Where you at? You can be what Lincoln was, pragmatic. I'm going to do what I got to do to get to where I want to go. Or you can be a person who's going to put it all on the line and say, I'm against slavery and I'm going to fight. You know, like a John Brown or somebody like that. You know, William Lloyd Garrison and others who will fight the system, you know, and go against the whole system and institution of slavery. So you have a situation where you can say very loosely that the Republican Party became the party that was against slavery, and that the Democratic Party was pro-slavery. Now, whether you was in the North or the South, the Democratic Party was white supremacist to the core. It was and it still is. It's just variations. It still is. And they have very little degrees between the Republican and Democratic Party to this day. There are some differences. You know, at that time, the Democratic Party was the so-called party of the common man. Therefore, it was a party that identified with average Americans. And the Republican Party, and I'd say that they were even at that time leaning more towards business at that time. And they were in the a stage of industrialization was right around the corner. It was coming, and they were ready to step into that, as opposed to the agrarians who still felt, because they were the richest, that the way to go was just keep growing crops and get stronger. Also, as your power grows, you start controlling, you know, civil liberties. You start controlling the court systems. You have a say in the roads that are being built. You have a say in literally everything because you are part of the aristocracy. And this is what basically became the challenge. That became the challenge at some point because there were rumblings from abolitionists to end slavery, and even there were even some Democrats who they were against the expansion. In other words, new territories. Give you an example. When America took many parts of Mexico, which included California, Oregon, Utah, and all of these various locations, many people said, let's not bring slavery into those territories. But at the same time, those who were, whether it was around Buchanan's time and many others, they didn't have a position on it. It was sort of laissez-faire. You could, but it's no big deal. So, you know, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, things like that sort of was a sign of things to come. So what do we have here? We have a situation where there have already been some major insurrections. You know, Nat Turner, Denmark, Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, and others. There had already been major slave revolts, and it was getting a little more costly to have a slave system, but there were controls. There was a system that they had in place, and this was basically controlled by the Democrats. You know, they had the Fugitive Slave Act. Anybody know what that is?
Catch a slave, you gotta return him.
You catch a slave, he must be returned to his master. And all authorities, in other words, even if he's in another state, in other words, you in Georgia, if you catch the slave and it's a runaway, you got to bring them all the way. You pass them on till you can get them back to South Carolina or to North Carolina or even to Virginia.
Even if it was a free state.
Well, yeah, there were no free states at that time. There were no free states. There were just places where slavery had occurred, and there was talk and discussions about whether they was going to open up the West to slavery or not. And they felt leave well enough alone for the most part. And so slavery continued. But for the most part, we had a situation where slavery, it was not expanding at that time, not as much. Now, people did take their slaves into areas where there was not slavery, and this is what caused the Dred Scott decision. This is what caused the Dred Scott decision. He went to, and there were other ones, the case in England, where when the slave master took his slave to England, and in doing that, that person that took the slave master to court, saying that he was free because he was in England, and they had outlawed slavery by that time. And it went into court, and the person was free. And so that's where you get the concept about free soil from certain places where you could, if you were free. Now that's what happened with Dred Scott. Dred Scott was in Missouri, which was considered free soil. And since it was free soil, he felt that he was free. And he went to court. And he actually won in court. Initially. Because they have a saying in that state, once free, always free. And so he felt that he had won. And when he took it to court, he did win initially because they were, for the most part, dumbfounded. So they just said, okay, well, you know, let him go. He's free. So he won initially, but there were those who said, no, this is a bad sign. Because everybody's going to try to get to free soil. And if you get to free soil, you'll be declared free. So this is why Chief Justice Taney, because of the diversity of jurisdiction between New York and St. Louis, Missouri, they were battling it in two courts. So it was kicked up. And when it got kicked up to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Taney ruled on it. And his ruling was, look, why is this even in court? He said this shouldn't even be in court. Dred Scott is not a citizen. He made that crystal clear. He said Dred Scott is not a citizen. These courts are for American citizens. He's not a citizen. In other words, he's nothing but chattel property. Consequently, this should not even be an issue. And just to make sure that no one will ever get it wrong, he said a white person, a black person has no rights that a white person is bound to respect. Make that crystal clear so that no matter who you are, you don't have to respect anything that a black person is telling you. You don't have to respect their position. You don't have to respect their property. You don't have to respect their family. They have no rights. And so that's something that Chief Justice Taney did that to this day is recognized. And this is why you have situations where, whether it's police, whether it's militias, when they do things to black people, there's literally no charge. And that's the way it's done. So, and that was in 1857. So you're talking about 4 years before the Civil War. So the Democratic Party was a party of slavery at that time. And the Republican Party by that time was formed. And so the Whigs became Republicans. And Lincoln was a Whig who was now a Republican. And his thing was, my problems with slavery is personal. Ain't got nothing to do with business. In other words, I don't own slaves. I've never owned slaves. I have friends that own slaves. You know, Joshua Speed was his friend. Well, I'll leave that other part alone.
Yeah.
He was more than a friend. Ain't that right, Harold? Harold, no. He was more than a friend, but that's a discussion for another day. But in any event, he personally, only on a personal level, he did not agree with slavery. Lincoln, this is Lincoln, he didn't agree with slavery. But he was not going to change the course of America and mess with big business for any black person, male or female. Wasn't going to do it. That was not his invocation. But he personally didn't like it personally. The reason why I keep saying personally, because I want you to understand that. It was a personal observation of his. He would never have engaged in a civil war for a black person. Because over 630,000 people lost their lives. That was 1/5 of America at that time. Were killed. And then we can't even begin to imagine how many people was wounded, how many limbs were lost. And back then, you know, the medical stages people were at, when you got certain wounds in your arms and legs, they just cut it off. So you had a lot of people with peg legs, a lot of people without arms,
Half a body.
and the like, and because, you know, that's where they were medically at that time. So you can't begin to imagine the carnage and the wounds, the deaths, the anguish and pain that this would cause, and he would not bring this into existence for slaves. Lincoln would not have done that. He did it to keep the Union together. Once South Carolina seceded, and then systematically other states in the South all started to secede from the Union, this is what caused the Civil War. Because he said, not under my watch. He said, we can all stay in this room and argue, but anybody that tries to walk out that door, gonna get you. I'm coming after you. And obviously they tried to walk out the door. They were gonna cut a deal with England and other European countries and then sell their cotton and other products directly to them. So this is what the war was over. It was a war, it was an economic war of sorts. So they were going to do that, and Lincoln was not going to allow that. He was not going to allow that under his watch to have a war to have that level of a war and not end it and then keep America together. This is why, this is why he's considered, for the most part, the most important American president ever. Him and George Washington started the ball rolling, but he continued it and kept America one country. So this is the importance of him, and he was a Whig. Now, they were the party of where the abolitionists drew their strength from. He would not have caused the war for his personal observations. It was only because this was business, and he was not going to allow America to be two countries. So I'm going to stop in a minute. I just want to wrap up this part and then I'll come back and do a little bit.
When you say, well, what he did was, it was really a conflict between the Northerners and the Southerners about who would be in power economically.
Yes, because the South was trying to cut a deal to deal directly, instead of their money and their interest coming up north, where it was New York, the market that sold the products to Europe.
Industry.
As
opposed to agriculture.
Yeah, so they would have the products. The North would turn those products into, whether it's pants, clothing, and the like, and then they would sell it to Europe and make a lot of money. So this is what they were doing, and that was going to be disrupted if the South chose to independently ship their products straight to Europe. So there was a conflict, and he had to end the conflict. And Buchanan, who was before him, could not decide on what to do. But as soon as Lincoln came in, he was decisive right away on how to handle this situation. And he was not going to allow, under his watch, America to be split in two. It's won today because of Lincoln. And Lincoln won that war because of us, black people who fought in that war. Over 210,000 black men fought in that war and was able to tip the scales to the North. Consequently, the North won and brought everybody back into the Union. And they could not keep us in chains anymore after that. And I'll just say one thing before we stop. One thing, Lincoln gave them more than enough time. And a part of his Emancipation Proclamation was, he said, I will give you the time to come back into the Union if you drop your arms. Put the gun down, and you can come back in and keep your slaves. You can come back in and keep your slaves. He said, however, if you keep your gun and don't drop it now, he said, when we win, you're going to lose your property and you're going to lose your slaves. And the South still went for it. Said, we're not going to drop the gun and we're going to fight. And that's what caused that war. And I'll get more into that history of what happened and Jackson, the role Andrew Jackson and so many others played. I'll do a little bit of that and then I'll save the rest for the next one. But we'll stop right here.
Okay, Zoom audience, you gotta unmute yourself. We're gonna have the famous Brooklyn William Mackey Jr.'s brother Ray Ray's lentil soup right now. You gotta do this. Okay, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the soup and everything. Okay, Brother Mike.
One thing I can say, well, I don't know.
Okay, I think I ended. I'm not even sure where I ended, but in any event, to get started again before we do Q&A, the Democratic Party, as I said, it rose to prominence based on a doctrine of white supremacy and domination with respect to being a part of the planet class. There did come a time for the Civil War, and they were told by Lincoln to put the guns down, which they refused to do, and they engaged in a war that eventually won black people their freedom. Now, obviously, there came a time where even though we were free, we were starting from scratch. And in starting from scratch, Southerners developed a system of which to, because of the way the laws were written, with the abolishment of slavery, you know, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It said, with the exception of if you commit state or federal crimes. So they had to find ways to arrest you, and then combine that with a convict leasing program where now you can arrest somebody literally for being vagrant, if nothing else, just by not having a source of income. Just by being a vagrant, you could be locked up. And once you're locked up, it's no telling how long your sentence is going to be, because that was open. And some people would work for years. Some people went in as a child. There were documents showing 8, 10-year-old children were locked up, and 12, 14, they were locked up, and they might have worked 8, 10, 15 years. Now, all of these presidents that we had, many of them Democrats, coming from the South, did not do anything. Now, obviously, William Monroe Trotter, NAACP, and other organizations were fighting this. Frederick Douglass and so many others, when this was initiated, convict leasing, debtor prisons, there were those that did fight the good fight, and certainly the NAACP was among them. William Monroe Trotter actually went to the White House.
Correct.
While Woodrow Wilson was in. And he had it out with Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson had him removed from the White House. And it wasn't too kind the way he was removed. But nonetheless, he was removed. Now, he fired literally all of the federal employees when he came in as president. I think he came in 1913 to 1921. Those are his 8 years. And when he was in, he fired most of the black people. Now, most of the black people who were in the federal service, as most of them were like dealing with the mail and things like that, they had a history, a military history, which got them that job. You couldn't get a job as good as the post office just from the street. Most of the time, you had to serve the country in the military capacity first. Now, Monroe Trotter also fought Woodrow Wilson on the fact that Woodrow Wilson was promoting the birth of a nation. Does everybody remember that?
Movie that made Hollywood famous.
Yes, it was a blockbuster in those days. It was the biggest movie and the most creative. As Spike Lee pointed out, the level of ingenuity it took to shoot that movie was ahead of its time. So I don't really know. I couldn't even tell you what those inventions and the new thing, whatever was nuanced about the way the movie was shot. But Spike has broken it down and said for its day, for 1915, it was ahead of its time. D.W. Griffith's movie. So William Monroe Trotter fought him on that. And he thought, because he had met with him earlier and supported him to become president. But once Woodrow Wilson got in, he turned his back on NAACP and all other blacks who he thought was who they thought would do good by black people. Now this is what, when Woodrow Wilson did that, let me see, do I? Yeah, I basically would say that that was the main reasons why William Monroe Trotter was on the outs with not only Woodrow Wilson, but he fought other blacks who were apologists. And you know, you got to remember, he was one of the founding members of the Niagara movement. And the Niagara movement was a movement of independent blacks. Really, the top black leaders all over the country got together and formed the Niagara movement. Now, most people would tell you that it was the Niagara movement that there came a time where it morphed into the NAACP. Kind of, sort of, but not exactly. But when what happened in Springfield, Illinois, the mass killings of blacks, and it happened in Villard, Ovington, Spingarn, and all of them were able to witness it, and they went up to the Niagara movement, upstate New York, to get together with them to do something about that. And that was 1908. And so what came out of that eventually was the NAACP in 1909. And these were whites, primarily Jews, that financed it. And this is why it's around to this very day. It was financed by Jewish people, which it still is to this day. And this is why it took over 40 years. It took like maybe to 1948 when they got their first black executive director, Walter White. And because it was run by Jews, they ran the NAACP. So whatever problem Jews had and wanted to have protests in a certain area, they used the NAACP to do that. And in turn, they got their rights, whether it was in Miami and other places, because of the NAACP. So William Monroe Trotter, at its inception, he backed out of the NAACP because William Monroe Trotter said, I'm not going to be a part of an organization that's run by Jews. Now, W.B. Du Bois and others, they didn't have a problem with it. But it was William Monroe Trotter. And you know, those two is just odd. When you think of those two, you know, they both went to Harvard the same time. And they both had their eye on the same system. And William Monroe Trotter won out. And that became his wife, and William Monroe Trotter got the most prestigious awards from Harvard at that time. you know, the cum laudes and all that stuff. He got all of that because he was the top of his class. But they enjoyed a certain amount of freedom, William Monroe Trotter and W.B. Du Bois, but at the point of the NAACP's inception, he backed out of it. Said, I'm not going to be a part of an organization run by Jews. But Woodrow Wilson had continued down that road he was on, and like I said, he fired everybody. Now, the planter class was basically, they had run the country up until the Civil War, and even after, some of them were able to recover and were able to retain some of what they owned, but they never quite came back the same. But the Democratic Party still stood for white supremacy. They were the ones, and I'm going to keep it short and start the Q&A in a second. They were the ones that, does anybody remember what happened in Wilmington? Wilmington, North Carolina? They were the ones in Wilmington, North Carolina, where it was sort of a fusion party. And black people were still voting at that time Republican. Why were black people involved in the Republican Party?
Party of Lincoln.
Because it's the party of Lincoln. That was the party that had members who was against slavery. And so when they won their freedom, they naturally gravitated towards the Republican Party. So black people and some whites formed the fusion ticket, and basically a lot of city council positions and went to black people, won these seats. When they won the seats, the white Democrats got mad and removed all of them from office. You talking about a coup? So we're talking about black sheriffs who had won seats, black elected officials in political office. White people stormed the streets, anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 in Wilmington, North Carolina.
1895?
1898.
Okay.
And killed everybody they could find.
That's right. Yeah.
Just outright. If they snatched you out of your office and let you live, you was lucky. Because they killed everybody in sight. This was the white Democratic Party. The current Democratic Party you see today systematically said they were not going to allow black people to govern them and remove them from power. Let me read something before I start the Q&A. Let me read something that a white Democrat said. This is by Benjamin Ryan Tillman. Anybody, is that name familiar with anybody? Benjamin Ryan Tillman.
Is that during the time when we occupied, that period when we occupied Congress?
No. This is after the Radical Reconstruction. We had a few good seats during the Reconstruction period, which lasted the most
10 years.
10 years. Let's just say 10 years. But this was in 1901, so this is well after, because the Reconstruction period that started in the 1870s that last, let's say 10 years, 12 max. By then it was over and all the black people lost all their seats everywhere. So now, Benjamin Ryan Tillman, he served as governor and a U.S. senator out of South Carolina. And this is what he said. We of the South have never recognized the rights of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to gratifying his lust for our wives and daughters without lynching him. I would to God every last one of them was in Africa, and that the name and that none of them was ever brought to our shores. This is what a governor said, and this was public information. You know. Now, he said that. I'll tell you what motivated him to say that. He said that because Booker T went to the White House. Booker T went to the White House. He didn't stay overnight. They assumed that he was going to spend the night. Booker T. Washington did not spend the night in the Lincoln bedroom and none of that stuff that they was all saying. But he basically had dinner with Theodore Roosevelt. And in doing so, that infuriated Tillman. And that's why Tillman said that. He went on to say, the action of President Theodore Roosevelt in entertaining that nigger, these are his words, in entertaining that nigger Booker T. Washington will necessitate our killing 1,000 niggers in the South before they learn their place again. This is what a sitting U.S. Senator said on the Senate floor. Y'all got that? He said that in the halls of Congress.
A Democrat?
Yeah, he's a Democrat.
It was
He's a
allowed.
Democrat.
It was allowed back then.
So, and like I said, this was only because Theodore Roosevelt invited a very prominent, who was the voice of Black America at that time, Booker T. Booker T. Washington was the preeminent leader of Black America at that time. Fred Douglass had died in like 1895, and Booker T was the man. So, and you know, obviously later on, it was Marcus Garvey who believed in what he saw of Booker T. Washington's program that brought him to the shores of America. So, it makes a lot of sense. Now, even Bilbo, just one other thing before we get started. Theodore Gilmore Bilbo, he was a master of the filibuster. Now, he's from Mississippi. He's the governor of Mississippi, state senator, House of Representatives. He did a little bit of everything. He said, in his scathing rhetoric, I'll just suffice in this long speech, I'll just say that he said, he used the word nigger 77 times in a speech in Congress. And he was proud of that and boasted that he used the word nigger 77 times in a speech. Because at that time, I'll put it to you this way. George Wallace lost a race in the early years. He lost one race in the early years, and he said he would never be out niggered again. Because the white person that beat him kept on referring to black people as niggas. And he was using the King's English. He was being proper, and he lost that race. And he said, I'll never be out niggered again. So if you're going to say nigger once, he's going to say it 5 times. If you say it twice, he's going to say it 10 times. So he stayed to his word and was never out niggered. That's his vocabulary, not mine. But that was the general attitude. And I'll say that that's what Bilbo did. That's basically what Tillman, he let people know how he felt, which was popular at that time. And I'd say to a certain degree, Buchanan brought some of that back, and then you had the Barry Grays on radio, and the, what's his name, Bob Grant, and others who brought a lot of that back. So you hear that now, but it was basically, it never left, but you got more people. So the Democratic Party has a long history, and I'll stop there to get into some Q&A. But the history is long, where they were consistently the party of white supremacy, and only because black people, because of FDR, started voting on the Democratic side because of the things that FDR was doing from 1933 on. And so by 36, black people started voting for FDR, and then it became solid by the time John F. Kennedy ran. Because he appeared in some circles to have concern for the civil rights movement, which he never did. But, yeah, him and his brother, but they had that working that somehow that they had a feeling, or had feelings for the civil rights movement, which is what solidified black people to vote Democrat. And now to this day, we're over 90%, 90-something percent, we vote Democrat. But if we look at that history, if we look at all the major massacres that occurred in this country, whether it was Chicago, New Jersey, New York draft riots, we can go all through the South. All those riots where black people were killed, you know about Rosewood. Obviously, you know about Black Wall Street and all of these instances. For the most part, we're talking about Democrats. And the Democrats that were white switched to the Republican Party after 1964. The present day Dixiecrats, which I'll get into next time because I'm going to stop now. But the Dixiecrats were the ones who later became Republicans because, as LBJ, you know, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president, pointed out when he did the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voters' Rights Act of 65, he said we lost the South. He said it will be decades before the South ever returns to the Democratic Party. And he was right about that. He was 100% right that the South to this day is still Republican for the most part. And only a few Southerners, whether it was Clinton, Carter, a few were able to garner some votes down there, but for the most part, the South to this day is still pro-Republican for the most part. And that was because, as I said, they switched from the Democratic Party, but the tenets of the Democratic Party was always white supremacists for literally 180 years or more. So there's been a little shift because of the big tent policies of the current Democratic Party, but make no mistake about it, its history is white supremacist at its core. But I'll stop right there and we'll get into some Q&A at this time.
Okay, any question from the floor, then question for the Zoom? Any from the floor?
Yes, sir.
Yes, how you doing? Thank you for the speech. So, today my question to you is in relation to the U.S. Constitution. So, I understand that the 3/5 clause came about as a result of the abolishment of slavery. Now, the 3/5 clause, which is in Article 1, Section 2, discusses how taxes are proportionate. So, my question to you, so many people believe the U.S. government is a corporation. Now, if you open the U.S. Constitution to Article 1, Section 2, which is pretty much in the beginning, you basically, in my opinion, you see the manual as to how the free slaves, free African Americans are being treated, I think because of this as a guideline of the U.S. Constitution, especially being that they say the U.S. is like a corporation. What's your take on that?
Okay, let me just correct a part of your question. The 3/5 clause was in effect during slavery. It wasn't an advent, something that happened after slavery. It occurred during slavery. So with the 3/5 clause, even though we were enslaved at that time, the 3/5 clause was a balance of power where the Southerners, because in states where black people were the majority, in Mississippi, in South Carolina, and places like that, black people were the majority. And the whites that were there understood to use these bodies for voting power because it was more people in the North, white people. It was more white people in the North than in the South. So what they used is they enslaved Africans and said they're 3/5 of a person, which means for every 5 you got 3 votes. So that's how it was used. So the 3/5 clause was always in effect. It was for political leverage, more so for anything, even though we understand that the Constitution itself is a document that's rife with racism to the core, and that we were not considered a human being. We were subhuman according to the Constitution at that time. So they made amendments later on, but the 3/5 clause was in effect even during slavery.
Can I just add one more thing? So to this day, like it's 2022, and this 3/5 clause was written like 2 centuries ago. Wouldn't you say that a white supremacist of today would look at this as his guideline as to how they should treat him?
Yeah, I would say that lawyers especially can argue this extremely well and not appear to be racist. This is what's called original intent. In other words, what was the intent of the founding fathers? So some people feel that the Constitution is fluid, but some say no, it's static. So whatever the original intent of the founding fathers were, that's my guideline. In other words, I'm going by what they thought because they established this. So in other words, the founding fathers understood what states' rights is. When most white supremacists, if you understand their language, they fight under what's called states' rights. In other words, the federal government cannot come in to this state and tell us how to handle our business. In other words, if we believe in handling black people in a certain way, it's none of your business. You stay the hell out of it. We will handle our own. If we need you, we'll call you. And trust us, we don't have to call you. We can handle this. And this is what's called states' rights, and that all comes out of what is considered original intent, which was the intent of the founding fathers, because the founding fathers could never envision black men getting on planes, flying around, pulling out plastic cars, renting this, buying this. They couldn't envision that. They couldn't envision black women voting. They made allowances that there was white women that were allowed to vote a few places, even though it wasn't official until 1920. But they could never envision, the original intent could never envision black people having rights, being able to go to court, having the rights of marriage, being able to negotiate contracts and do things, have civil service jobs. They couldn't envision that. So that comes out of the philosophy of original intent, because they say that this was not what the founding fathers intended.
But that's, but people see, to go on that, but that's why you got supremacy clause, where you gotta take it to the Supreme Court now, to over the states. Because if the state conflict, you got supremacy clause going to determine, if that's the higher court going to determine how the laws should be interpreted.
Well, there, you have to remember that when a situation happens in court, there are stages before it will go to the Supreme Court. You have various, whether it's of a criminal nature or an administrative nature, you have various courts, and then in most states, the highest court is the Court of Appeals. If it's not resolved there, then it can get kicked up to the Supreme Court. But states have avenues to resolve problems long before it gets to the Supreme Court. But if it does not,
when it's a matter, if it's a question of constitution.
Right, if it's constitutional, they will address it until it's sort of a crisis, like what happened with Dred Scott. And in those situations, something get kicked up to the Supreme Court. Whether you know it or not, the other day, last week, Amber Guyver, she just had her third appeal. She got 3 appeals. Now, she killed a black man, both of them, John. She killed both of them, John, in his apartment. She claimed that she thought she was in her apartment and that the door was ajar. She claimed that she was able to go into her apartment, the door was ajar, and she went in and she pulled out her weapon.
Although the door was ajar.
This is, was that?
Although the door was ajar.
Yeah, well, first of all, the door wasn't ajar. It was proven that the door cannot be ajar because it was a safety, a fireproof door where the door is either open or it's closed. Right. It can't be in the middle. Right. It was one of those doors. Right. And her key did not fit that door, so how did she get in? Right. So she was lying left and right. She lied and lied and lied. She just threw all of her stuff on the wall, and whatever would stick, it stuck. So when she ran out of lies, and neighbors who heard her banging on the door, trying to get into the apartment, but he wouldn't let her in. Obviously, they had a relationship. And he tried to just ignore her as long as he could, but she kept banging on the door. So he eventually let her in, and he sat on the couch eating ice cream, and she blew him away. So she appealed twice last year, and then just last week, she had a third appeal. So she's exhausted all of her appeals.
So basically the grapes was too high, she burned down the tree.
Yeah, well, whatever the situation was.
But now she done exhausted all her.
The most you can have is 3. But she did it all. She did it all inside of between last year and this year. But she's eligible for parole in 2020.
She got 6 to 10.
Yes.
Question, Keisha?
Yeah, can you expound upon the relationship Andrew Jackson had to South Carolina, if you can?
Well, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, that's what they call him, Old Hickory. He, what he did prior to becoming president, obviously he was a general, and he was a part of the War of 1812. And he was, his reputation was he was known for being a great Indian killer. Yes. You know, he murdered mercilessly Native Americans. You know, he hated Native Americans and blacks. I mean, his level of hate exceeded the average white man. It was real, deep-seated hatred. So, after he did that, he rose in prominence, because one thing that does not hurt you in the white community is your hate for black people. And that was not in any way precluding him from advancing. So he did that, and as he became more prominent and ran, he was known as the guy for the common man. He fought against the Central Bank of America at that time because he saw the problems with the Central Bank and that it would develop a more powerful class of people that could undermine America, and he knew that the investments coming from France and other places, that it was a danger. But he was one of those Democrats that hated black people, moved up the ranks, and of course, he was the one that did the Trail of Tears.
Oh, Hanson?
No, Jackson.
Jackson.
Oh, that's what she's asking about, Jackson. Y'all know the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was when Native Americans from the East Coast were all marched to Oklahoma. And they had to walk. If you stop walking, they blow your brains out right on the spot. The soldiers. So this was, you know, in the 1830s. Okay, but
Zoom, anybody from the Zoom got a question? Okay, anybody? Raheem?
Okay, appreciate what you said, or understand correctly. When you kept mentioning the planters.
okay, let me explain the planters.
And one more question.
Okay.
And there was another female who she left out the NAACP. You know who that is? She didn't agree with, you know.
Oh yeah, I know who it is, but I want somebody to answer it.
Was it Mary? No, that's not the founder, Mary White, right? Who?
She just said, okay.
What did you say?
Ida.
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you.
She walked away, Ida B. Wells walked away from the NAACP because she, like William Monroe Trotter said, she's not going to be a part of a group that's run by Jews. You know, but it was Ida B. Wells that took a very strong stance, and that was controversial at that time. Okay, now in terms of your planter question, you have to remember that that's what they were called then. They would be businessmen now. They would be major plantation owners now. But at that time, they were called the planter class. It was a system of prominent businessmen who became extremely powerful. And of course, some of these founding fathers, George Washington among them, and Jefferson and others, these were the men that ruled with supreme power. And these were the people that sent themselves or their designees to Philadelphia for the Articles of Confederation. They were the ones who ran America, which was 13 independent states at that time. So that planter class, make no mistake about it, they were extremely polished. They knew their business. They knew the art of a deal. But there did come a time where their business was sort of railroaded because in the North, they started taking over a part of the business. Now, the richest people still was in the South, but it had to go through the North that negotiated the prices of which was going to Europe, and that created problems. But that planter class, make no mistake about it, they were not just planters. They were rich, prominent businessmen that sent their children to the finest schools.
Now, what
That planters or planters?
Planters.
But wasn't it Quincy Adams?
Just put in planter class, and it should say something like Southern aristocracy, something along those lines.
Property too.
Wasn't it Quincy Adams that did not own slaves?
That's correct.
He was, I think, maybe the only one.
That's the 6th
And,
president. You're not talking about the 2nd, John Adams.
no,
You're talking about John Quincy Adams, his son.
Quincy Adams. And also, was that, who was the one with the, it was the lawyer, Alistair?
Well, yeah, he defended those Africans
Yeah.
as a young lawyer coming up. John Quincy Adams.
Well, most of them were
Okay.
lawyers, right? Most of the founders were lawyers.
A lot of them were, but just remember, at that time, you was a lawyer if you wanted to be. That's part of the colonial days. In other words, you didn't have to have a formal education.
Right.
You can go into a lawyer's office and be his apprentice. And once you are his apprentice for a certain amount of years, he will start giving you cases to actually do. And then you could set up your own office and do your own thing. So a lot of the founders, were lawyers, but that doesn't mean they all went to Harvard.
Right.
It only means that,
Or law school.
what's that?
Or law school.
Or law school. It only meant that some of them, Lincoln was a lawyer, but Lincoln was an apprentice. It's not like he went to college. He was an apprentice to a lawyer. So, that's how, and later on, he competed against that very lawyer that trained him, but.
So the planter and agrarian, what was the difference between two of them?
No, that's one of the same. Agrarian only meaning that you earn your livelihood by what comes out of the earth. So that's agriculture. So agrarian, we're talking about agriculture. If we say you are part of industry, then you're a part of an age that was coming into existence where you were using machines. You were a part of factories. You were a part of big business in that degree. So that became the dynamic eventually. But at one time, the richest people in America were they were agrarian.
Yeah, we can call it slave owners, but that's euphemism. I think it's just a nice word to say.
Yeah. If you want to call them plantation owners, slave owners. Next.
Any other question?
I got it.
Hey, Ray, I put my question in the chat. Can you read that to Mike, please?
Okay.
Who was that, Calvin?
Okay,
From Brother Brian.
okay.
Oh, Brian.
Mike, wasn't Donna Brazile, black woman, the former president of the Democratic Party? And Richard Steele was the former press of the Republican Party, black man.
Yes, yes, to both. Donna Brazile, I think she lost her position. She lost her position because she actually, the questions that were going to be utilized, she gave them in advance to Hillary Clinton. And she got busted, from what I understand, because she gave those questions. She gave Hillary Clinton a heads up on what the questions would be so that she could prepare herself. And with respect to Steele was the chairperson of the Republican National Convention, and he was, for those few years, in charge of raising money, supporting candidates of the Republican Party, but and they wanted him to be an attack dog on President, Barack Hussein Obama. And since he wasn't fulfilling it to the extent that they wanted to see him attack Obama. Once the chains were off and they were able to freely attack Obama, they didn't need him anymore and they got rid of him.
He's a pawn.
All right, who else?
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
I want to say something.
The term white supremacy has been thrown around a lot.
Yes, it
Where
has.
does that term come from, and who coined it, and when was that coined?
Well, okay, the question was, who coined the term white supremacy? Where did it come from? And basically, I'll just say that I'm not sure that when you have, I'm not sure if it's exactly colloquial, but when you say white supremacy, it is mainly just saying that that is the category of people that are in charge. Consequently, when you say that, it does not denote intellectual genius. Because what they're saying is that the worst white man is better situated than the best black man. In other words, if you dig ditches for a living and you're white, you are better than a black doctor or a black lawyer. So the basic term for that process and for that level of thinking is just white supremacy.
Did white people come up with that term? Or?
Yeah, that's a white term. Also, even things like cracker. Cracker is a term that they made.
What cracker?
Because they would call you a good cracker. If they saw you whip a black man, the next time they would see you, he would say to his buddy, yo, that guy over there, that's a good cracker. Because he can crack that whip. Yes.
Actually,
So it should be derogatory.
it came from Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun. In fact, he felt that Jackson wasn't radical enough, and he threatened to beat the hell out of him if Jackson had his own vice president arrested. So that's where it came from. He said, we are the supreme people. So that's where it came from. John C. Calhoun. Yeah.
What about the Klan? Doesn't the Ku Klux Klan have something to do with that term?
Well, I'm not sure that they had anything to do with the term, but I would say that they feel that they are the paragons, that they are what undergirds white supremacy, that they are the stormtroopers. They feel that they are the vanguard. So I'm not so sure if in any way they coined the phrase, but they feel that they are the vanguard of white supremacy and that all of its protections is based on them, and that they felt that without them, the South would fall overnight. With all the black people there and all the skills in the South that black people have, bricklaying, plumbing, architecture, and the various things that black people can do, they feel that without them, the South will fall. So they are the vanguard. They felt that they are the vanguard of white supremacy, even though the White Citizens Council in some places would feel that they were the ones that kept everything white, kept the races separated, kept the white children from the black children. But there's no doubt about it that the Ku Klux Klan, more so than anybody, because it's the oldest terrorist group in America. Somebody said, what? Yeah, it's a terrorist group. Somebody said, what? It's a terrorist group. They are the oldest and the longest running terrorist group in America, the Ku Klux Klan.
I thought it might have been some more. I think it
I
had
thought
to
you would say the police.
What's that?
I thought you would say the police because they started out as slave hunters.
I hear you there.
I was gonna say,
Well,
that's how Rittenhouse was able to go past.
Well, I would say
He made
that
it his form.
you have to remember, before there was, even long before there was formations of real police departments and law enforcement was everything from the marshals and sheriffs, because most southern towns, when you go way back, the sheriffs were the guys. They were in charge of everything. But I would say that the Klan, hands down, feels that, and that's what D.W. Griffin's movie was about. You have to remember, it was a silent movie, but it was profound in what it was, the emotions it was able to provoke. So that movie, Birth of a Nation, that 3-hour movie, is still worth seeing to this day. And you will see the impact that it made, and that the Ku Klux Klan were the heroes. So even though there were police agencies, obviously the culture of police agencies are white supremacist at its core. No group can epitomify white supremacy better than the Ku Klux Klan. It has always been that, and I'm sure it'll always be that, more so than any other group.
I have a question. When was the first time that reparations was discussed? Was this discussed as soon as Civil War ended, or was reparations discussed like years after that, much years after that?
I would say that in the early years, we had pioneers that even Harriet Tubman had to fight for years to get her pension.
Yeah.
It took her years to get a pension because she was, I'll say she was like a sergeant in the army, in the Union Army. She was a spy. So Harriet Tubman had to fight for years, but before she died, she did get a pension. I'm not sure if it was retroactive, but she did get a pension. It took her years to fight for it, and there were quite a few leaders who began at that time talking about reparations. Obviously, under the Martin Delaney's of the world and later the Garveys and stuff, it became more popular. But I dare say that in those early years right after slavery, people wanted some recompense for what they had did for free. And so that is not a new concept, you know, reparations. It's more popular now than it's ever been. But
There's actually a law, there's actually something written, I can't think of it right now, where there was ability, the 40 acres in the mule was due as a form of reparation.
that's Special Field Order 15. Now, that Special Field Order 15 was an order where these contraband units, that's what they were. When Sherman was blazing across Georgia and places like that, black people just followed him. And in following him, he wanted them to stop following him because he had an army to attend to. So he just said, you know what? While he's going across Georgia, that whole South Carolina area, those islands, he just said, you know what? Y'all can have this. And that's why so many black people to this day started owning property along those islands, the Gullah Islands, the Geechee people, and all that. He started giving them because, as President Lincoln had pointed out, if you don't put your guns down, you're going to lose everything. And so a lot of them did lose their property. And it was given to black people, and since he was giving them property, it was like, that's going to be your 40 acres and a mule. There was no mule, but you got the 40 acres, and you just had to break your back and make it work. But it was Johnson, you know, of course, you know, Lincoln told him to stop that practice. So Lincoln did it first, but it was Johnson, right after Lincoln was assassinated, it was Johnson who hated black people that immediately told his generals, take all that land back. Okay. Some of it was taken back.
Okay, real quick. When did the African Americans become Democrats?
I would say the earliest time that black people actually started voting Democrat was in 1936. That was for FDR's second term in office for president. He came in 33, so when he ran for re-election in 36, was the first time black people actually voted for a Democrat.
Because the Republicans back then?
Because of the WPA and other programs he put into existence was aiding black people. It was helping white Americans, but it also helped black Americans. So he in turn, when he did that, it helped black people, and black people started seeing that, wow, this Democrat is really doing things, which was different. And you have to remember that no Democratic president before FDR addressed the convict leasing. That fell on deaf ears. As much as the NAACP and others fought to stop the convict leasing, no one listened to it. All those presidents, it was
FDR.
It was FDR for the first time said this got to end.
The New Deal.
Well, it wasn't actually a part of the New Deal, but what he did was very quietly told the southern states, you got to stop that.
Really?
You got to stop locking up black people with all this vagrancy and these debtor prisons and all this stuff. You got to stop doing that.
Works Progress Administration.
So I would say that I would say in 1936 is when it started, but what capitalized it was actually during the Kennedy administration. Because you got to remember, Dr. King's father was a Republican.
That's correct.
Dr. King was a Democrat, but his father was a Republican. So you have to remember that there did come a time when there was a switch. And so that switch occurred during the Kennedy years. And when Johnson signed in 64, you know, Kennedy was killed in 63. In 64, the Civil Rights Act, he said then that for the next 2 generations, the South is lost. So he saw the writing on the wall. That's very intelligent for him to understand, you know, the complicity of it and say that we lost the South by giving black people, you know, these rights, the Civil Rights Act 64, Voters' Rights 65, the Fair Housing in 68, it lost the South.
Now we're back to square one.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I want